Good afternoon. I'm Simone Cavallaro, Director of the Stigler Center. Before we start, I would like to express our gratitude once again to the healthcare and frontline workers, both in the US and abroad. Thank you. And thank you all for tuning in today for this webinar in our series of the political economy of COVID-19, which explores the global economic and political implications of the pandemic with leading academics and experts. Today, we're happy to host Professor Julia Cagé and Andrea Prat for a conversation moderated by Guy Rolnik on Julia's news book, The Price of Democracy, How Money Shapes Politics and What to Do About It, and the implication of the pandemic and its aftermath for democracy and beyond. If you're interested in purchasing the book, I encourage you to do so from our campus bookstore partner, the Seminary Co-op. You can find the direct link on the event description. Before we begin, please note, we're on the record and live streaming to the Stigler Center YouTube channel. Please feel free to share the broadcast on your social media. If you have questions for the speakers, please submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. The last 15 minutes of the webinar will be devoted to answering those questions. As usual, views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. As you may know, the Stigler Center promotes and diffuses research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. We have many initiatives to help both students, alumni, faculty, and the greater community stay connected and informed in this difficult period, including weekly episodes of our podcast, Capital Isn't, co-hosted by Luigi Zingales and Kate Waldock, focused on coronavirus-related topics. New coronavirus and COVID economy sections in our online publication, promarket.org. More upcoming webinars in this series with speakers including Thomas Piketty, Wendell Potter, Julia Angwin, Betsy Reed, and more. So please continue checking our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay informed. Back to this afternoon. We look forward to an engaging conversation. But before we begin, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Julia Cagé is an assistant professor of economics at Sciences Po Paris and the co-director of the research group Evaluation of Democracy at the Lab for Interdisciplinary Evaluation of Public Policies. She is also a research affiliate of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Her research areas include political economy, organizational economics, and economic history. In addition to her last book, she authored two more, including Save the Media, Capitalism, Crowdfunding, and Democracy. Andrea Prat is the Richard Paul Richman Professor of Business at Columbia Business School and Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics at Columbia University. His work focuses on organizational economics and political economy. Professor Prat is a principal investigator of the Executive Time Use Project. One focus of his current research is also the influence of the media industry on the democratic process. He has been published in leading journals and is an associate editor of Theoretical Economics and the director of the IO program of the Center for Economics Policy Research. Our moderator today is Guy Rolnik, who is a clinical associate professor of strategic management at Chicago Booth, where he teaches classes on the political economy of regulation and the news media. He has over 30 years of experience in financial journalism, business, and politics, among others. For the last few years, his work has been focused on dynamics of regulatory capture, a topic dear to the Stigler Center. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Stigler Center Political Economy of COVID-19 series. And today the discussion is on money and politics, COVID-19 and the future of democracy. After 6 weeks of a pandemic sweeping the globe and taking the lives of more than 200,000 people, most other important discussions on the health and future of our economies and democracies were naturally pushed aside. Yet the different ways in which governments around the world reacted to the virus outbreak and the various extraordinary measures that were taken and are taken today highlighted perhaps more than any time since World War II, the importance and the fragility of democratic institutions and well-functioning governments. Our discussion today touches at the heart of one of the most important issues we study here at the Stigler Center, influence of money and special interests on politics and democracies. Julia Cagé and Andrea Prat were both part of the distinguished group of scholars who have gathered here last year to write a policy report on the questions of protecting and fostering independent journalism in the age of digital monopolies. Therefore, I have asked both of them to discuss today also the role of corporate media in the money and politics game. To set the stage for our discussion today, we'll start with a short presentation of Julia with the main findings of her recent book. Julia, please.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot, Guy, for the introduction, Simone, and thanks, Andrea. I'm going to go quickly through the presentation of my new book, The Price of Democracy. As you see at the bottom of this slide, there is a website associated to the book, thepriceofdemocracy.com, and if you go on the website, you will find much more information, a lot of data, and also a number of like figures and tables from the book. So let me go very quickly through what I do in the book. The departure point of the book is to try to understand what we are facing today and the current crisis of representation, which on the one hand, the collapse in turnout at elections, the collapse in confidence in politicians and in media, and also the fact that more and more we see far-right politicians making it to the government. And the departure point of the book is to say that this crisis of representation is linked to the capture of the democratic game by private interest, and in particular by private money, through the funding of elections and through the funding of political parties. The part of the book is devoted to the fact of establishing a number of facts on the role played by money in the political game. But the idea of the book is also to draw a number of solutions to improve things for the future. And in order to draw solutions for the future, what I propose to do in the book is to do kind of a tour of the world and a travel through time to see, in fact, a number of different experiments of public funding of democracy and of private funding of democracy to try to understand what works and what doesn't work. And so in the book, I cover the US, I cover Canada, I cover France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and a number of different countries that have tried to do a number of things, in particular to reduce the weight of private money into politics. And I'm going to draw on this historical experience to make a number of proposals that we will have the opportunity to discuss later today. I just want to insist on one important thing, even if it may seem obvious. Democracy has a cost, elections have a cost, and political parties cost money. What you see on this slide is how much money political parties spent in different countries in per capita terms. So you see Germany, Belgium, Spain, France, Italy, UK. What I want to show you here is the fact that the cost of democracy, and in particular the funding of political parties and how much political parties spent, depend on the regulation. And if you see much more spending in Germany than in France or in Belgium, for example, this is due to the fact that in Germany there is no regulation of how much firms and individuals can give to political parties. In Italy, there is not a lot of regulation, so we should expect parties to spend more. But the thing is that in Italy, as in the UK, there is no public funding of political parties. So given that there is no public funding and public money for political parties, they have less money to spend on what? On creating ideas or animating the political debate. This is just a few numbers from the US. You also see that in the US, if you look at the spending of candidates in the three major US elections, the presidential election, the Senate, and the congressional elections, you see that regulation matter. Why? Because if you look at the evolution since the 1990s, it was kind of flat slowly increasing, and then you have this huge rise in spending by PACs, and this is due to the 2010 Supreme Court decision, Citizen United. So democracy has a cost. One of the questions is who pays for this cost, but we see that this cost varies through time. It varies depending of the countries, and this is due to differences in regulation. Now, in a sense, the big issue is who is going to pay for this cost of democracy. And in particular, and this is, I think, an interesting parallel that we can do between democracy and the media. If you look at the media, if you pay for the information you consume, so for example, you subscribe to a newspaper, if you pay for the information you consume, you know that you are the one paying for it. Now, if you consume the information for free, if you use an ad blocker so that the media outlet is not going to receive any advertising revenue, so you don't pay directly for the information you consume, there is no advertising revenues for the media outlet, but then you have someone who may be a billionaire, who decide to buy the media outlet and to produce information at a cost that you are going to consume for free, then you should wonder what are the motivations behind this investment by the billionaire in question. And this is the same thing for democracy. The big issue is why are some people in the US, the main example would be like the Koch brothers, but you have many other people. Why do we see some people willing to spend money, $1 million, hundreds of $millions on elections, on political parties? And in fact, what do they expect in exchange of this investment? Now, in a perfect world, we would define democracy by one person, one vote. But if we look at who is paying for democracy as of today, what do we see? We see a huge concentration of campaign contributions. So only a few people that are among the richest people spend money on campaign. This is very clear in the US. In the US, these facts have been established a long time ago. For example, in a paper by Adam Bonica and Howard Rosenthal. The title of the paper is super interesting. This is about why democracy didn't lead to a decrease in inequality. And the fact that there is no decrease in economic inequality with democracy is partly linked to the fact that democracy is captured by private interest. But in a sense, you will tell me that, okay, we already know that money matters in the US, but at least if you look at other countries, in particular in Europe, we have regulated the weight of money in elections. And one of the things that I really do in my book is that I show that even in a country like France, here you have like some like data for France, where donations to parties are strongly capped by law. So for example, in France, you cannot give more than 7,500 euros a year to political parties. So you may say, okay, so you cannot give more than like 8,000 euros. This is peanuts compared to the US. So in France, we shouldn't see any like concentration in terms of giving, and democracy should work better. In fact, we see that it is not the case, and we see a huge amount of concentration among donations, even in a country with a cap that is below 10,000 euros. And this is one of the reasons why, in my book, what I propose is to have a much lower cap, like $200 a year. Why? Because if you look at the majority of the people, like people just like having a job and getting the median income every year, they cannot give like 10,000 bucks a year to a political party. Even 200 euros or dollar may be an important investment. So this is the first thing that I show in the book is that even in countries where like money in politics is limited, we see that donations to political parties are strongly associated with social class preferences. And this is not only true for France. So you saw the US, you saw France, like these are some numbers for the UK or Germany. If you go through the book or on the website, you will see this evidence for a number of different countries around the world. Like two more facts. One is the fact that the fact that not everybody is giving money to political parties, but that this is a social class phenomenon, and that the rich give much more than the poor to political parties. You also see that when you look at who are the parties who receive more funding, and you see that on average, the right-wing parties, so I would say the pro-business party, they tend to receive much more donation than the left-wing party. And here again, you see that it is the case in all the different European countries that we consider. And this is also the case in the US if you compare the Republican Party with the Democratic Party. The main issue, and this is really something I want to insist on, because I think this is where we find the link between the crisis of representation and the capture of democracy by private interest. The fact that parties rely on donations, and that people tend to give more money to right-wing parties than to left-wing parties, it had led traditional left-wing parties, in particular the Democrats in the US, to abandon redistribution, to abandon inequality, and just to concentrate on some cultural issues. And this has created a big split between poor and middle-income people and the Democratic Party as of today in the United States. To which I want to add one important thing. If you look at Germany, if you look at Italy, if you look at a country like France, when you give money to a political party, you receive some fiscal deduction from the government. It means that the government, all the people are paying to satisfy the political preferences of the richest. Then you may tell me, okay, that's good, but we're in the US and this is not the case in the US. This is not the case in the US for political donations, but you can receive tax deductions when you give money to a number of foundations, including think tanks. So in a sense, this is also the case that in the US, through tax deduction, the government subsidize the political preferences of the richest people. Last point I want to insist on, and you see this is a screenshot from the website of the book. You have that for France. You also have that for the UK. What I did both for France and the UK is that I put online all the numbers of money spent by candidates in all the local elections and the legislative elections also in the UK. The data went back in 1993 in France. In the UK, it covers all the elections in the 20th century, plus the election up to 2017 in the UK. And what you see for all these elections is a clear correlation about between how much a candidate spent and the number of votes he is going to obtain. And you know, I think we have spent too much time in political science and in economics, like discussing why there is so little money in politics. I guess it was the case at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, if you look at the data, even in the US, people won't say that there is not enough money in politics. The prediction we have for this year election is that there will be between like $3 and $4 billion spent on the 2020 election, and this is a lot of money, even in per capita term. The last point I want to quickly highlight is, in a sense, that this huge weight of money into politics have an important negative consequence is the fact that politicians tend to take into account the preferences of the most affluent and not the preferences of the poor and the middle income people. You have a book by Martin Gilens and Ben Page. In this book, what they talk about is what they call democracy by coincidence. And what they say is that democracy is still working as of today, because by coincidence, it turns that on a number of different issues, the preferences of the poor and of the rich, they coincide. But the day when they will no longer coincide, And I'm afraid that it maybe this day, then we will face a big crisis of representation because people are going to be unhappy with today's democratic system. So I would stop there.
Right, thank you, Julia. Andrea will now respond, please.
Great. I really enjoyed this book. It's I think it's a very important book for anyone who's interested in the present of democracy and the future of democracy. The starting point is the ideal one person, one vote. And then Julia makes two empirical points. I'm going actually backward. The second point she makes is that money buys votes. So this is an empirical point. The candidates who happen to get more money, and she didn't have the time to go through it, but there are, she has contributed to this literature with a paper where it estimates this causally. The candidates who spend more money are more likely to be elected. She even throws a number there, 32 euros on average to buy a vote in France. There is a very large literature on this topic in the US. So money buys votes, first point. And the second point is that some people are contributing much more than others. And this is not random. This is basically the rich. The rich are contributing much more, and hence the rich are being able to buy votes, and they're being able to direct the democratic process. Now, this is true in the US, in France, in Italy, in Germany, the UK, and I believe in other countries she considers. So this is a widespread phenomenon. Money is buying elections. There is a very important, there are a number of important points here. One very important point for people with a transatlantic connection is that until Julia's book, most of us had the idea that campaign finance was a US problem. This was true both in the US and in Europe. Europeans would think campaign finance is really, except for some pathologies, it's really an American problem. And because we don't have a constitutional protection of campaign spending, and hence we don't have that problem. People in the US used to make the other argument, you say also the campaign finance is a US problem, and hence we have to look at Europe for ways to solve it. So there was very much this asymmetric view. Now what your book does, Julia, is to explode that myth. This is a problem everywhere. It takes different shapes in different places, and it's probably true that it's quantitatively much worse in the US, but it is a global problem. And if we were to study other countries, we would probably find it there too. So I think this is an important book also because it shows the universality of this problem. This begs the question, solutions. So what can we do about this? And the fact that it is a universal problem is kind of telling us that we should be looking for a universal solution, a solution that at least can be declined in many ways in different countries, but should be based on similar spirits. Now, we face a difficulty here. We face a difficulty because the solution will probably have to do with public funding. You put it in your book, you put it in a nice way. You said public funding of political democracy is, like democracy itself, the worst funding system with the exception of all others. And I totally agree on that. But I wonder if you can sort of explore this idea, and in particular explore mechanisms that may make this as effective as possible.
Yeah.
Julia, please.
So thanks. Thanks a lot. Well, looking for my, yes. So like the first thing I want to highlight is what we shouldn't do, and then I would say what we should do. What we shouldn't do is put an end to the public funding of democracy. And I know that a lot of people, when they look today at the state of democracy, and when they realize that democracy is captured by private interest, if you see that democracy is captured by private interest, you won't think automatically that the best we can do is to spend even more money on democracy. You would say, okay, all these politicians are corrupted, so I'm not going to use my tax money to pay for them. And in fact, this is the solution. And if you look at like two countries on this slide, Italy on the one hand and the US on the other hand, they both have gone through the opposite way. Both Italy and the US, they innovated in the 1970s in terms of public funding of their democracy. And both of them, in front of the crisis of the democratic system, they've decided to put an end to the public funding of democracy. Just, this is a correlation, but this is of interest. The 2018 elections in Italy, when the very first one since 1974 with no public funding of the democratic system, and you had the victory of the far-right party, La Liga, as well as of the Five Star Movement. And if you look at the US, the very first elections since 1976, without any public funding, was the 2016 election with the victory of Trump. So I think these are interesting facts. So what are the solutions I propose in the books? There are like three main solutions. The first is really to limit private donations much more than what we do today. So I say no more than 200 euros per voter. And the second solution is to have a new funding system of democracy that I call the democratic equality voters. What is the idea behind the democracy equality voters is to give each citizen each year an equal amount of money that he can spend on the political parties of his or her choice. The idea is really that this is an equal amount of money for all the citizens. So you have like one person equal like $7 or $10 equal one vote. So to equalize all the citizens and to reintroduce some like democracy into the democratic system. And the second idea behind this system is really to have something that is kind of dynamic. So you have this funding scheme that works on an annual basis. And this is very important if you look at the way it works in a number of countries where all the funding of democracy is either linked to previous electoral results or linked to a given election. Here, I want to create some like continuous democracy when I give citizens the opportunity to express their opinion on an annual basis. This idea of democratic equality voters, it does not come out of nowhere. It is inspired by a number of different experiences. First, the presidential fund in the US, which at the end of the day was a failure, but it was a failure because it was poorly implemented. In particular, you had in the US this option of like opting out the system for presidential election candidates. And at the end of the day, today, the candidates, they prefer to spend more private money rather than receiving some public funding. It is also inspired by a system from Italy that is called the due per mille, 2 per thousand. The main issue with the Italian system is that the public funding is a function of how much income you have. This is like 2 per thousand of your income tax. And in my proposal, this is the same amount for all the citizens, independently of their revenue. This is also inspired about another experiment in the US that are the Seattle Democratic voters. In Seattle, since 2017, for the local elections, citizens, they receive 4 vouchers of $25 each that they can allocate to the candidate of their choice. And this is a way to introduce a public scheme rather than private funding of democracy. There are a lot of proposals now that make me pretty optimistic. Like Lawrence Lessig was already in 2015 proposing something that is close to the Seattle Democratic voter. There were a Democracy Dollars Act that was introduced by Representative Rokana in December 2018. If you look at the last report published by the Harvard Law School that is called the Clean Slate for Worker Power, in this report you also have some proposal for a federal democracy voucher program, and one of the 2020 primary election candidates in the US, Andrew Yang, also have a democracy dollar proposal. So I really think that now, even in a country like the US, people are willing to have a system with less private money and more public money, and through some kind of some voucher scheme, we can reach this goal. In the book, I go even like a little bit further than that, because I say that the crisis of representation that we face today is partly linked to issue of like funding, and we need to solve this funding issue. But then there is also a big issue that is linked to the fact that the blue-collar workers are completely absent from the Congress. Again, this has been studied in particular in the context of the US, for example, by Nicolas Carnes, who has a very nice book that is called White Collar Government. I go one step further in the book by establishing the same facts in a number of countries. We have it in the US, we have the same trend in a country like France. This is exactly the same happening in the UK. And the thing is that it is not improving over time. It is worse today than it was even like 10 or 12 years ago. So we see that if we don't do anything, we won't have more blue-collar workers in Congress in the future. So we need to introduce some regulation. First, we need to introduce some regulation to limit the capture of the game by private interest, and we need to introduce some regulation to ensure social parity in the way our legislative institutions work.
Thank you, Julia. I'll now ask you a couple of questions, follow-up questions. So do you think that crowdfunding through the internet changed in any way the role of money in politics, or the concentration of money in politics, what some people might call the Bernie Sanders phenomena that we've seen very vividly in the last elections in the US?
It has been the case a little bit, in particular through this ActBlue software and the ActBlue application. So like the Democratic Party put this ActBlue application online in 2004, so 16 years ago. But then it took a lot of importance, beginning with Bernie Sanders, and even more in the 2018 election, where a lot of Democratic candidates receive a lot of like small donations through ActBlue. So we see that there is kind of a change, and you have some people now that are willing to give like small amount of money. If you look at ActBlue numbers, you have like donations to like $5, $10, $15 and people giving like multiple dimes a month to different candidates. So we have this like technological tool that can improve a little bit the situation. But what do we see? We see that when this is happening now, you have more small donations, like for Bernie Sanders, but then you will also always have other candidates with even more money, given that there is no regulation. And at some point, you know, and this is the kind of numbers that the Koch brothers talk about. If they are willing to spend $1 billion per election cycle, like the level of inequality is so important in the US that with no regulation of private money, like these small donations will never be enough at the end of the day to reestablish a working democracy.
Andrea, in many countries where campaign funding is more limited, capturing politics, whether it's legislators or even regulators, is done through softer channels that are less transparent, more difficult to quantify. And the news media, of course, is a case in point. So you have studied media capture by both corporations and governments, politicians. And the question I want to ask you is, can it be that our efforts to limit money in politics will turn out to be less effective than we forecast as long as the very same people who now give campaign contribution will move to the other channel and of financing or buying the news media, thereby influencing the reputation of politicians or even threatening them.
Yeah, so indeed, this is I think a very closely related problem. It's another, the other important instance of money buying votes is to the media. By the way, here Julia too has an important book, Saving the Media, which came out 2 or 3 years ago, and it deals with many of these issues. There's now a lot of evidence of this phenomenon. It can kind of there's kind of 3 pieces of evidence that we have. The first one is just about media ownership. Media ownership is extremely concentrated. Measuring media ownership has become much harder because we get information, we get political information through a lot of channels. We have, we have thousands of websites we can go on to. And so some people made the argument media ownership is no longer a problem because you can choose so much stuff. But the truth is that people's attention is very concentrated. And so if you actually look, like we did in my study with Patrick Kennedy, if you look at what news sources people actually use, you see a lot of concentration. For instance, in the US, and the way you measure that is by measuring how where people devote their attention, when they look for news sources. And most of us use a very limited number of sources, typically 1 TV station and maybe 1 online source. So what we find is that in the US, for instance, there's a lot of concentration. The source that receives the most attention is News Corporation, in particular Fox News, and followed by Facebook. That's another source that people use a lot for news. So there's a lot of concentration here. Why should we worry? Well, we should worry because the other piece of information that this literature has shown is that there's causal evidence, strong causal evidence, that getting more information makes voter better at keeping politicians accountable. So it makes voters more likely to kick out corrupt politicians. It makes politicians work harder. And also redistributing information from the rich to the poor means, we have evidence for that too, means that the government will pay more attention to the underprivileged. The third piece of evidence shifts votes. And this is the so-called Fox News effect. There are 2 papers here, very, very influential. In the second paper by Martin Urukoglu, they show, and this is causal identification, that Fox News shifted around 6% of the vote in 2008. So this is a very large number. So this is something we worry a lot about. And now you see why this is very close to the campaign finance problem. Richer people are in a better position to acquire media organizations, and they can then use them to influence the political system. So I would like to, and in fact, in your book, Julia, in chapter 4, you discuss this this link, and it's called the media tool for influence. I would like to ask you, if possible, to draw some parallels between the solutions you identify here and the solutions we might have to think about media.
Julia, please.
Yes, so last year, Guy referred to it a little bit better. So with Guy, with Andrea, with Anya Schifrin, with Brian Knight, and Ellen Goodman, a couple of other people, we kind of sit for a couple of months to try to find solutions to save the media industry. It was true before the coronavirus crisis. It's even more true today when we see like a collapse in the size of the newsroom, and already some like newspaper closure in the US for local newspaper, and more media deserts. We need more money to save the production of local information. The big issue in terms of public funding for the media is that very often this has been used as a way to capture the media, not by very rich people in this case, but by the government. And so what we wanted to propose was a scheme to publicly fund the media without any government intervention, so that we have like public money, but no capture. And the solution we came up with is what we call the media vouchers proposal, was to give, in the US context, $50 every year to all the US adults that they can allocate at the time of their, when they fill their tax form, to the media outlet or the media outlets of their choice. So the idea is really to use a decentralized allocation of public funding. So really like the state is just there to provide the money. Then the citizens are in charge of the allocation. And the additional feature of our media vouchers proposal was that, given that we wanted to avoid that all the vouchers were giving to fund some big media outlets that were already doing very well, we put a cap, and we say that no media outlet can receive more than 1% of the total amount of the media vouchers, because we really want to encourage pluralism, and this is kind of key, in particular linked to Andrea work. He already referred to that, but the fact that the concentration of the media industry today is more important than ever, and so we need to ensure the creation and survival of small independent media outlets.
Thank you, Julia. So I want to bring this conversation to today, and the next question is for both of you, Julia and Andrea. So perhaps some of the most important political changes and economic reforms throughout history came after large, significant shocks, crises, and actually pandemics. Do you see any hints that this is going to play out here this time, whether in the US, Europe, or developing countries, that the economic crisis will bring about political changes and forces that will address some of the challenges that we discussed today? Or maybe the reverse, and actually it's going to get worse? Please. Julia, you want to start?
I can start. I think for the US, the November elections will play an even more important role than the crisis. So perhaps what is happening today in terms of crisis management is going to influence the outcome of the 2020 election. But basically, in a nutshell, I think that if Trump is re-elected, in terms of like concentration of the media, funding of the media, public funding of democracy, limitations to private donations, there will be no change in the US. If I look at other countries, if I look at France, for example, a lot is being said about, okay, we need to think about a different future, including by the government. But for now, there is no clear proposal on the table. Some more interesting things that is happening in terms of economic inequality, and a way to fight against economic inequality is what is happening today in Spain. For example, when the government may implement universal income in front of the crisis. So if it were to be the case, this will be an important change that will last way after the crisis. But I don't want to be like over optimistic. And I think from my point of view, the basic answer is that we don't know, because we don't even know when this mess is going to end.
All right, thank you. Andrea, please.
I think one of the, in the current political climate, one of the most important things we're witnessing is a lot of attention market power and competition and concentration. So it's something that that started, I would say, about 5 years ago. People started getting very worried about concentration in different ways. While in the past it was mostly about market power, I think we now see that concentration has other effects. We see that concentrations have has effects on politics. One example is media concentration. So media concentration may make newspapers more expensive, but that's not what we're interested about. What we're interested about is the fact that if you concentrate a lot of influence power in few organizations, we risk having capture there. And so I think that one of the most important general movements you have now is a movement to rethink concentration and rethink what we need to do to fight concentration. We also see it for digital platforms. Everybody agrees that they often have too much power, but the existing categories, antitrust categories, allow us to do very little about that. And we worry not just for consumers, but we worry in their ability to shape public life. And so I think that going back to what the role is of economists and other social scientists here, I think this is a very active area of research. It's too early to give very precise solutions, but I think this is a very important area, and there's a lot of empirical work like Julia's being done. There's also a lot of new ideas, important ideas being thrown around. So that's I'm optimistic that we will make progress there. And I also see some candidates around the world taking these ideas much more seriously. Two of the Democratic primary contenders had ideas along those lines.
Thank you, Andrea. We have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'd like to start with the Q&A with the audience. The first question would be, would the democratic equality vouchers, Julia, system push politicians even more towards populism? And I believe that we heard this question when we talked about the media voucher. We heard the same thing. What do you think?
I think it may be the case in the very short run. It won't be the case in the long run. I think one of the reasons why we see this rise in populist parties, even if I don't like this word populist, because we can put like everything into like a single word with very different, like if we put like Orban and Salvini and Bolsonaro and Trump and like the far right in France, and use the same word for all these different political parties and ideas, it's a way to have basically no clear like solution or no clear proposal. But like if we were to define for like 2 seconds populist party as party that tells the people we are going to represent you, because look at the traditional political parties, they don't do it. If you look at the direct consequences of the democratic vouchers, it will be a way to reconcile the political parties, the traditional political parties, with the citizens. It will be a way to put an end to the capture of the system by private interest. It has to be democratic equality vouchers plus limitations of private donations. You need to limit private money and to have this new way to allocate public fundings. I think after like 2 or 3 or 4 elections, given that thanks to this system, we will have candidates who will no longer spend all their time raising money and organizing some dinners with millionaires or billionaires, but just go and talk to the people, the real people, the normal people, the people who vote, people with like middle income, like poor people, and just talk to them and try to take into account their preferences. I think at the end of the day, this will be the defeat of the populist parties. And we need to fight against the populist parties by putting into place a number of institutions, so that we improve the way our democratic system work as of today. And this is not by saying, okay, let's limit even more the power of citizens, just to be sure, they are not going to give some money to Fox News, they are not going to give some money to this party because I don't like this party. If you give less power to people, they will trust even less the system. So we need to trust the citizens, and I guess what the citizens really want is more equality. The democratic equality voters, the media voters, is a way to give more power to the people in an equal way, and at the end of the day, the outcome can only be positive.
All right, thank you. I think the next question is for Andrea to answer. Do you think we should ban media outlets dependent on rich people's funding?
It's a very good question, and we've had very visible cases of media being bought by rich people. Coming from Italy, I know how important this can become. In Italy, at some point in the 80s, Berlusconi became the owner of the largest commercial network, and there's no doubt that helped him get to power. So my answer is two things. We should prevent too much concentration to build up, and that will help already there. And then we should also think about ways to maintain media independent from their owners. So we should think about governance structures that apply to media in particular, to newspapers, to television networks, whereby the owner cannot influence the editorial line and cannot dismiss, for instance, the director in easy way. So I would add some governance guarantees there.
So, by the way, do we have any example of such corporate governance that has been successful, that separates ownership with influence on the editorial line, on decisions?
Well, for state-owned media, we know that there's a lot of variance in governance. The BBC is the example. So although I think the Queen formally appoints the board, but there's a very big distance between the government and the BBC leadership. So if the government is displeased with what the BBC reports, it's very hard for the government, it's impossible for the government to punish the BBC. If you're looking at other countries, including Italy, the state television is much more directly controlled by the government, which means that its independence is much less guaranteed. So I think we can the BBC model would be a very good one.
Julia, we have a question here about your theory of change. So the question is, how can those in power be convinced or incentivized to change today's structure from which they obviously derive so much benefit?
So I was referring before
you
to...
have to unmute yourself? Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I was referring before to the book by Lawrence Lessig, Republic Lost. One of the things that Lawrence Lessig did is that in 2016, he decided to run for president in the US, and he said, I will be like a one reform president. I will limit private donations to campaign in the US, and then I would quit. And he said that the only way for me to have the good incentives to reform the way the private funding and the public funding works is by being not willing to stay in power or not willing to run again. The bad side of this story is that at the end of the day, Lessig didn't get enough funding to make it through the democratic primaries and was not elected, obviously. So this is part of the answer, but I don't think that this is the good way to answer the question, because you don't want a president that just make it for one reform. I think we need citizens to ask for change. The change won't come from those in power if no one is asking them to do something about it. And this is one of the reasons why I decided to write a book. This is not something that is obvious for an economist. Even more when you are not tenured, you are not supposed to write books, you can write articles. I think one thing that is important with books is that books can be read by the majority of the people, and you can put a number of important facts on the table. On the table, I wanted to tell to people, in particular in European countries, you tend to consider that the US are a counterexample, but we are not doing very well either with the way we fund our democracy, and we should also regulate campaign finance in Europe. In the US, I wanted to have a kind of a different message, because people already realize that there is like way too much money in US politics, but I wanted to tell US people that, you can do much better. And if you want to know how you can do much better, you should just have a look at the history of the US. And it turns out that in 1971, 1974, when the US introduced the Presidential Fund, when the US created the Federal Election Commission, when the US decided to put a lot of public money into their politics, they were one of the very first countries in the world to do so. So at the time, they innovated in a positive way, and there is no reason why they couldn't change their mind on that. And I just want to finish by highlighting one important thing. The reason why today you have decisions such as Citizens United in the US is because the Supreme Court considered that money is speech. But the First Amendment in the US did not change during the 20th century. This is still the same constitution. This is one of the nice things about the US. There is like one constitution that never changed. This is the same constitution. In the 1970s, from the same constitution, the Supreme Court decided that we need to regulate private donations, and that money was not speech, and that firms and companies in particular shouldn't be allowed to give money to political parties and to campaigns. And so I think we shouldn't consider that nothing can be done in the US because the Supreme Court decided that it's impossible to regulate. We can innovate. The city of Seattle innovated with the democracy voters. Bernie Sanders innovated in a sense when he decided not to accept donations above $200 and to rely on small donations. But politicians will innovate even more if the citizens ask them to do something about this issue. And I think the citizens should realize that the absence of campaign finance regulation today is having a huge democratic cost, both in terms of political inequality, but also in terms of economic inequality as a consequence.
All right, thank you, Julia. We need to end pretty soon. So before we end, I would like to end with a more, perhaps a positive and more optimistic note. So the question for Julia and Andrea is, when you look across the globe, do you see any model that where democracy works better, where there is less inequality, where you think the democratic institutions are less influenced by special interest, and the same thing goes for, and we see that the news media there, also we have a better landscape. Perhaps Andrea, you'll start.
One example,
Julia, please.
In terms of the way the democratic landscape works, I have one example, but you will have a little bit of fun. It's Belgium. So this is a very small country, but in Belgium, they regulate a lot the funding of their parties. You cannot give more than 500 euros a year to any political parties. There is a very important public funding scheme, and at the end of the day, there is less corruption in Belgian politics than in other countries. Now, if you look in terms of media, Andrea was lighting BBC in the UK. I think in the UK, the example of The Guardian, is also an example of something that works pretty well with a non-profit media organization. And in terms of public funding, the Nordic countries are doing much better for the media than other countries. Interestingly, the Nordic countries are not spending money to fund their political parties, but at least they spend a lot of money in a pretty nice way to publicly fund their media.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, I think rather than one country, one of the things that really emerges from this conversation is that these are global problems. Most countries face very similar problems when it comes to money and politics. One thing that we've done in the past is everybody in their own country has looked at their own country, their own institutions from one special way. And I think stuff like Facebook has shown us that these problems are really universal. So I like very much the idea of pick and choose. So various countries have very interesting examples. The Seattle experiment, I think, is amazing. I think every country should learn from that experiment. Definitely, the BBC is one model, and other Scandinavian countries have more of a pluralistic state model where they fund more than one organization. And you can, I think that would be very interesting. And it's a continuum between that model and the vouchers that that we were discussing. It's sort of going already in the direction. So I see a bunch of models that could be used. One thing I really enjoy about this field is that it has this very global perspective, and so the papers that come out here are about many countries, many emerging countries are also extremely interesting cases.
Okay, we need to conclude. Julia Cagé, thank you very much. Andrea Prat, thank you very much. And for those of you who are interested in the healthcare system, and specifically in the capture of healthcare system by special interest, next week, our webinar on May 4th is about the healthcare system in the United States with Wendell Potter and Neil Mahoney. And I'm sure that some of the issues that we discussed today will be also on that webinar. So thank you all, and see you next week, and thank you for participating. Bye-bye.